Bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Grave diggers.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, folks. This is a special episode today.
Yeah, a bonus episode. I feel so safe in the bonus episodes because there's only like 10 of you, so really let loose.
It's at our most loyal cultists.
Guys, you are not going to believe this. I said last episode that I had an allergy attack, which I did, and I had to go to the hospital. And it happened again, almost. So I was at a restaurant today outside because there's only outdoor dining. It's the first day. I ordered a crepe with arugula and goat's cheese and honey, and they brought me a crepe, and the crepe had Nutella in it.
Oh, dear.
So I took medication like pretty much straight away, which my partner went and got for me from the pharmacy, and I feel absolutely fine. But if I sound like I'm on drugs, I took drugs today.
Do you think someone is trying to assassinate you?
Maybe. I'm the new Fidel.
Yeah, or Hugo Chavez. They probably trying to do the cancer gun and then the allergy gun.
Maybe it's after my close call with the Saudi embassy.
Oh yeah, that was interesting to say the least.
But should we get into it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very topical episode. First of all, because it's the anniversary of the Hillsborough accident last Thursday, April 15th. But also, in discussing football and the fans and the working class background, it's very apt because the news has come out that 12 European clubs have decided to quit the Champions League and basically go their own way and form an oligarchy, like a formal oligarchy, basically pissing on the working class fans of the clubs in order to make a few more $1 million.
I've seen a lot of talk about this on the timeline.
Yeah, it's awful. I'm genuinely livid. Like, I don't know if the people listening know how much I love Chelsea, like the football club, but this is so bad that I might actually disown Chelsea. Like, I'm genuinely, if they continue with this, I'm not going to follow them. I'm going to just watch local football and stuff, but...
Wow. Bold statement.
It's really bad. It's really, really bad. I can get into it later and discuss why it's bad at the end of the episode.
Definitely, if you have thoughts on this, comment on our post. We love to read your comments.
Yes. So, it's April 15th, 1989, and your club, Liverpool FC, have reached the semi-finals of the oldest club competition in the world, the FA Cup. They're due to face Nottingham Forest in the neutral venue of Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. Somehow, you manage to snag a couple of tickets. You go in, you're in the Leppings Lane terrace behind one of the goals. But somehow you begin to feel dizzy as bodies are crushed around you. Some people are yelling and others are being pulled up from the lower tier to the upper tier by fellow fans. A few try to climb the fences that separate the stands from the football pitch but are stopped by the police. Eventually you manage to escape the crush. You learn that 94 people have lost their lives that day. Another dies a few days later. And a 96th dies in 1993, having been kept in a vegetative state since this day. You're alive, fortunately, but the day after, you turn over the newspaper to find the press accusing you and your fellow fans of causing the crush. You're called hooligans and thugs and worse, and you're accused of pissing on paramedics and fighting with the police. It's your fault, you are told. This is exactly what happened on April 15th, 1989. What began as a bright Saturday with football to enjoy ended in tragedy, and it was no mere accident. At every moment of the disaster, local authorities failed to act. Moreover, they then conspired to cover up their many failures. This cover-up ran from the Yorkshire police up to the very highest pinnacle of power, the British government. So, before I get into the actual tragedy, I do want to discuss that in the 70s and the 80s, there have been issues about what is called football hooliganism in Europe and in England in particular, where what are called firms in which organized fans of a particular club in an organized group would arrange to fight fans of another group. So the fans would be like, they'd arrange for the fights to happen, and then they'd get in and they'd fight. People get hurt in these fights and people die. But in addition to organizing this with other firms, sometimes innocent bystanders get hurt and fans of other teams that are not involved in these firms get hurt. So it's not exactly just, two people who want to have a fight get into a fight. It's a lot more, violent than that. And one good example is the Hazel riot in Brussels, where Liverpool had been scheduled to play Juventus in the UEFA Cup on 29th of May 1985. And Liverpool hooligans rushed and charged at Juventus fans, mostly families, by the way, not like, Juventus ultras or anything. And the fans basically fleeing the Liverpool hooligans, they congregated and crowded at an area of the stadium that was decrepit and it collapsed, killing 39 Juventus fans. These events have occurred often enough that the authorities they felt that they needed to act, which meant that they, treating football hooligans as basically animals, they decided that the correct response is to build high fences that separate the pitch from the stands and, treating all football fans like either hooligans or hooligans to be.
I actually looked up the etymology for the word hooligan because I'm a little freak like that. And as I suspected, it is not good. So this is a quote from an article titled How Soccer Helped an Ethnic Slur Take Over Europe by Nikhil Sanad for Quartz magazine. Quote, the term hooligan is widely believed to come from an Irish surname, either Houlihan or O'Hooligan. Whichever it was, the name was used in Victorian England as a byword for ethnic stereotypes of the Irish as disreputable lowlives. That usage is thought to have been spread through the music halls of time, where vaudevillians acted out comic sketches and songs. A character named Hooligan or O'Hooligan regularly appeared in these performances as such a stereotype. One show featured a Mr. Patsy O'Hooligan, whose appearance is as disreputable as his conduct is discreditable, explained The Era, a British weekly newspaper that came to be known for its theatre coverage in 1894. It adds that one actor is exceedingly comical as the wild Irishman O'Hooligan. Following that, hooligan begins to be used in England as a general term for a ruffian. End quote. So there you have it, folks. Even the term hooligan itself was originally an ethnic slur toward Irish people. Now, I believe that language can evolve, and as an Irish person, I don't take personal offense at the word, but it's worth noting how this phrase itself is historically wrapped up in stereotyping and looking down on a group of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's very classist nowadays and it's a very loaded term, obviously. And I think it's very interesting that, a lot of terms that we might think are innocuous today, or at least not entirely racial in background, are. For example, I learned the other day that paddy wagon is basically an Irish slur as well, like
rounding up the drunks. Right, exactly.
Yeah, which is, great, because if there's anything the English have invented and perfected, it's racism towards the Irish. But also, during this time, the time of before Hillsborough in the 70s and 80s, the British government had taken a policy, led by Thatcher, of course, who had, basically gutted the working class, anything north of the M5. The idea was that deindustrialization was going to happen either ways. And Thatcher didn't give a fuck about, creating government support or public support for the workers who are losing their industrial jobs, as the UK transitioned from an industrial powerhouse to a financial hub, mostly centered around London. So if you're not in finance in London, everyone else is pretty much fucked. And you have the loss of economic prosperity and job opportunities across the Midlands in the north. So Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Sunderland. Even now, you go to these towns and they're very fucking grim, to be honest with you. I remember touring the UK in 2011, looking for going on university tours in anticipation for applications of university. And I remember going to Leeds and to Southampton and to these cities. And it's outside of a small downtown core, it was very, very grim and depressing. This political economy, transitioning as it was accompanied by a cultural shift where the British press and the British culture began demonizing the British working class as these uneducated, drunk hooligans, these thugs, these people who are lesser than, And it was also apparent during the time of the Yorkshire Ripper, which we can get into another episode, how the authorities viewed his victims, who were mostly single mothers of families or so on, as prostitutes, even though some of them weren't prostitutes, just because they were single mothers.
Right. And you have these terms. You have hooligan, which, as we said, is based in an ethnic stereotype. Then you've got thugs, of course. Chavs is one that I've heard pretty roundly used in the UK to demonize the working class. Scroungers is another one you hear, which typically describes someone who's dependent on government benefits. And they all have the effect, of course, of just saying this entire group of people, be it working class, people on benefits, people who are not middle class or wealthy, essentially, have a culture of their own, a personality type of their own. And that personality is one to be looked down upon.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really, really depressing. Also, one of the words I did learn recently, it's actually a slur and you're not supposed to use, is pikey, apparently, which is against the Roma people in Britain.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Pikey's one, knacker is another really bad one.
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
Knacker's more Irish, but yeah, don't say it. So, football has long been tied to the image of the working class in Britain. It's very much considered a people's game, and industrial workers or unions have historically formed clubs. It's a leisure activity that people of even the most disadvantaged economic backgrounds can enjoy, as all you theoretically need is a ball and some open space. Hence the sport's global popularity, from the favelas of Brazil to the townships of South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was a kid in Bahrain, and like sometimes after school, you'd gather with your friends, and in some cases, we don't have parks with like goals in them, like actual goals. So we'd play football, and the only thing we needed was a ball, because for goals, we just like pile jackets and backpacks, like separated by some distance, like we decide on the spot, and that's going to be our goal. Literally all that. And, you don't even need shoes because, you could just play with barefoot or with socks or whatever. It's really the working class sport, I think. And coming with the news today that the 12 clubs are splitting to form their own Super League, it really, really shows how football, which has been created by and for the working class, has now been stolen by capital. What was the saying Mark said, that like capital strips the halo out of every profession, from doctor and so on? Apparently it also involves football.
I mean, football is so popular among the global working class that I know in Brazil specifically, and I think these are FIFA rules as well, one team has to wear a light kit, light jerseys, and one team has to wear dark ones. And the contrast has to be enough that you can tell the difference on a black and white TV, because so many poor people in the favelas are still dependent on black and white and satellite TV to watch the games. And it's considered like a human right. So if you are not wearing kits that can be differentiated in black and white, you are depriving those people of their right to enjoy the football match.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is a good example as well. Every club, not even just in Brazil, but like it's a FIFA rule, like you said, that every club must have a home and away kit, and they must be distinct enough that one is light and one is dark, distinct enough that, you could tell that one is light and one is dark. And I think, that's a good example of how it's meant to be accessible to everyone. It is the people's sport. In the UK, at least, when you think of like the elites, like the Eton types, the Oxford, Cambridge types, you have things like rugby and cricket. But football has long been the domain of workers from Liverpool, from Birmingham, from Manchester, and so on and so forth.
Oh, I would say if you're going to pick a sport that emblemizes the wealthy upper aristocrat class of the UK, it would be fox hunting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Isn't fox hunting illegal now? I don't know. Last I checked, I heard it was the Tories were basically running on a campaign of bringing it back or something.
I think it is outlawed in England and Wales and likely Scotland, but I know that it's still permissible in the north of Ireland.
That is really weird. Like, imagine like telling your friends, yeah, me and my mates are going fox hunting. That is just bizarre, in my opinion.
Yeah, if you don't know what fox hunting is, it's basically when men and women, but usually men on horseback, use hound dogs to chase down and then corner a fox, and then they kill the fox.
Yeah, and it's not like, actual hunting where you go into the wild and like try and like capture an animal. The fox is already captured and they release him, and then they all chase him on horses and foxhounds just to kill him.
Right. It's arguably a very cruel sport, and I think it speaks volumes, symbolically at least, about the wealthy class cornering this little animal with dogs and killing it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it shows how sadistic they are, in my opinion. And to me, when you hear about things like Jeffrey Epstein, it's perfectly plausible to me because, yes, they're sadistic. They view things that are weaker than them as lesser than and deserving of suffering and pain. And The suffering and pain of people and animals deemed lesser than them brings them pleasure.
Right, and crucially view these things as objects of sport, like things that you can abuse for your own amusement. It's sadistic.
Exactly. But yeah, we went way outside of the bounds of this episode. So bring it back, we were talking about the FA Cup semi-final, which was scheduled for April 15th, 1989, a Saturday, and it was Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest. It was set in the neutral venue of Hillsborough Stadium because FA Cup semi-finals have to be set in neutral venues, along with the final, of course. Now it's always Wembley in London. But at the time, it would rotate based on whichever club is not in the semi-finals. They can host it sometimes. So Hillsborough, which is the stadium for the club Sheffield Wednesday, was hosting the semi-final. For our American listeners, it is a very common rule as one of the products of the result of hooliganism in the 70s and 80s is that in football, across Europe, by the way, and across the world, really, if you're a fan of a club and you enter the stadium, you have to be sitting in a particular area. Like the fans of the two opposing sides, whether it's European clubs or local English clubs, they are separated into separate stands. And depending on the rivalry and the history of violence, sometimes they'll leave parts of the middle stands empty to separate the fans even further, like a gap of empty seats. In this case, Liverpool, even though they had the larger fan base, were given less space. They were chucked into the north and west stand. The west stand is also called the Leppings Lane. I'm going to start calling it the Leppings Lane in this episode, but it's the west stand of Hillsborough Stadium. And the Leppings Lane in particular is a stand, it's double-tiered stand. So you have like a lower tier and an upper tier, and the upper tier is seated, and the lower tier is for standing room only. And by the way, after Hillsborough, all standing rooms were banned, and all stadia were converted to all-seaters as one of the results of Hillsborough. But at the time, there were stadia where you had areas that were just terraces, like a pen, and some number of fans are allowed in and they get to stand. And it's usually cheaper, so it's working-class fans who can't afford the seated areas. They'd go in, you'd have beer, etc., and it would be terraced. So like the fans at the back can stand on a terrace that's higher than the fans in the front, but there's no seats. Nottingham Forest, on the other hand, they're given the south and east stands, and the fans are prohibited from mixing not just in the stands, but approaching the stands. So the police have made it such that you can only approach the stand from one route if you're a Liverpool fan and one route if you're a Nottingham Forest fan, except the way the stadium was designed, if you're a Liverpool fan, you've been bottlenecked and funneled into this one area with like 5 turnstiles for every Liverpool fan to come through for both the north and west stands. So because of the intent to separate the fans, entrances that would have otherwise been used for the north stand were closed, and the people who had seats in the north stand were being herded into the west stand as well. So you had this setup where all these Liverpool fans were being herded into such a small area to enter that the red flags were already there that something was going to happen and it was going to be bad.
As Amr just suggested, there were already a huge number of Yorkshire police officers out before the match in anticipation of some sort of hooliganism. Additionally, a scandal in the months before the match where a group of police officers pranked a rookie by ambushing him and faking an armed robbery led to the chief superintendent's resignation, meaning that the new chief superintendent, David Duckenfield, was fresh and inexperienced. Now, first off, David Duckenfield is a ridiculous name. Very cartoonish. Shame on Mr. and Mrs. Duckenfield for that one. And second, police are a gang. Like, they haze each other, and this shit has real effects on the community.
Oh, this shit is awful, and they're definitely like a frat. But the first thing I thought of when I heard this part is it would have been hilarious if they tried to prank an American cop and he just empties his clip into them before they even reveal that it's a prank. It would have been fucking hilarious.
That's a good point. Oh my god.
Yeah, you could tell that it's Britain because, you know, they fake an armed robbery without fearing that the cop is just going to empty his fucking pistol into them.
I think I read, a prank is only good if everyone laughs after. And that's so true.
Oh yeah. I think if a prank means that somebody gets angry after or hurt, it's not a fucking prank. It's just, you know, hazing or abuse or so on.
Right.
Yeah, cops are gang. ACAB 1312. So the stage is set and, you know, all these factors are being enabled. And, you know, it's no wonder the disaster ended up striking because you have the fans converging on the stadium. And at this point, 5,000 Liverpool fans are trying to enter via a limited number of turnstiles, causing this bottleneck, like I said. And the match was scheduled to start at 3 p.m. So you have fans, and usually in football, before the match starts, you're all in the concourse or in nearby pubs having a few, you're praying, having a few beers. And then like 5 or so minutes before the match, you sort of shuffle in. And in this case, because of the bottleneck, you had a situation where some fans who were refused entry, whether their tickets were deemed forgeries or like the wrong entrance or what have you, they were trapped because of the bottleneck, which meant that they can't leave. And the fans behind them are basically pressing them in. And this is causing this crush, right? And one of the constables in the area sees that there is a delay and those fans in the back are getting agitated because they want to enter without missing the match. So he sends a request to his superiors to delay the match. And just to let you know, this has happened before. Like, it is normal for cops, if they realize that things are getting rough, to request a delay of a match. It has happened before for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes. Just to allow all fans to enter safely and make sure that nothing happens, like fans don't rush to see the match. But this request, for whatever reason, was denied.
I almost wonder if it was denied in part to punish these fans for being late, almost treating them like children and sort of saying, oh, if you're going to push or you're going to be late, we're not going to do you a favor and delay this for you, even though it's in the interest of public safety.
Oh, yeah. I mean, during the inquiry after the event, one of the cops was like, it's not our fault they're late. And even months later and years later, I think in the 1990s, this judge who was tasked with reviewing the inquiry in the 90s, he got into trouble because he was supposed to meet with these Liverpool, like the families of the victims. And for some reason, he decided to like complain and say, of course, Liverpool fans are always late to their meetings. So, yeah.
Jesus. Also, I've been to a host of concerts and sporting events and other just sort of large arena events, crowd events in my life. They never start on time. You don't expect them to start on time.
Oh, yeah. And like, it's very normal for people to mill about in the areas outside of the stands, like the concourse and stuff, and then sort of make their way in at a trickle. But because of the bottleneck and because the request was denied, the fans began getting agitated because they wanted to enter to see the match because they paid to see this match. Instead of allowing the request to delay the match, the match superintendent, David Duckenfield, decided to allow one of the large exit gates for the Leppings Lane, Gate C, which again, like I say, is an exit gate. It was meant to be open to let fans out of the Leppings Lane, was open to let fans in and relieve the pressure on the turnstiles. And then exit gates A and B were open for the same reason. So you can see where this is going now. Fans begin entering the Leppings Lane through all 3 exit gates, and the way the stand is designed, all 3 exit gates funnel into the lower tier of the Leppings Lane stand, so the area that's standing room only. The standing room area is further subdivided into several pens, and each pen is separated from other pens by fencing, and you had pens 1 through 7, but gates A through C, the exit gates that were open to allow fans in, all funneled into pens 3 and 4.
The pens, which were introduced in 1985, made crowding more dangerous by trapping fans in one area. So essentially, if you have ever been to a game or a match at an arena, your ticket will always say, you are in section 204. And you go to that section, you find your seat. So imagine if essentially that entire section were blocked off with gates perpendicular to the stands, and you couldn't go to section 205 or 203. You would be penned in. So these fans could no longer move sideways if they felt suffocated.
Yeah, even the word pen betrays how the authorities see the fans. They're animals to them.
Definitely. And there was also a crush in 1981 at the Hillsborough Stadium where thankfully nobody was killed, but authorities should have been aware of this possibility since it had happened 8 years before. And frankly, anytime there is a crowd, there is a frightening chance of a crush.
Oh, yeah. I mean, whenever I'm in an event that's like a crowd, whether it's like, a concert or a rave or whatever, if it's a seated stadium or whatever, then I'll find my seat and sit. But if it's a standing room only and there's no set like seats, then for me personally, I tend to try and find roomy areas in the back because I'd rather be in roomy areas than up in the front and trapped in case anything happens.
And in standing room only crowds at concerts, I'm 25 years old. I'm old enough to drink in any country, I think. I don't drink if I'm near the front because I'm so afraid that if I leave to go to the bathroom or to get another drink and I try to come back to my spot in the crowd, that I'll be pushed or crushed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really, for me, I'm not a front guy. Like, I'll always be in the back. I'd rather have space. And, there's just so many possibilities of crushes. There's so many incidents of crushes happening in crowds that I'd rather not risk it.
With this and the COVID pandemic, I don't think I'm ever going to feel really safe in a crowd again.
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually, I wonder with the COVID pandemic after, even after everyone's vaccinated or what have you, I wonder how things like crowds will come back, if at all.
Yeah, you can catch me at the rave in 2028 wearing a face mask.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if face masks become fashion accessories in raves. That'd be funny.
For sure. Yeah.
So, you could see where this is going. And pens 3 and 4, which were the pens where the fans were being funneled into, were already overcrowded and there was no room for the fans to leave between the pens being separated by fencing. And then there's also fencing separating the pens from the pitch. So, the fans at the front couldn't just scale the stands and enter the pitch. They were just being crushed between the fans behind them and the fencing. But the fans in the back were not aware of this overcrowdedness because usually there would be stewards or constables placed at the entrance to the pens, and they would do regular eye checks to see how full the pens were. And if the pens reach capacity, which is usually 3,000 people, 2,000 people, the constables or stewards would redirect fans to other entrances to go to other pens. But for some other reason, no one explained it properly. No one has given a justification. There were no stewards in the entrances. So fans kept streaming in, thinking that there is room when there's no room, and there's just more and more and more bodies piling up in this small space.
If you watch the documentary Hillsborough, it's available on ESPN Plus. It's directed by Daniel Gordon. You can see how crowded the stands are, with your own human eyes.
Yeah, and again, normally, if you get a ticket, like Aaron said, if you get a ticket at an event these days and it's an all-seater stadium, your ticket will tell you section 205, seats 13A and B or whatever. And, you go to your seat and that's your seat. But in the time of pens and standing room area pens, there's just a vague limit on the number of people that are allowed in. And it's usually the responsibility of the local authorities, whether they're stewards of the stadium or police or whatever, to redirect fans once they see that it's reaching capacity. And for whatever reason, there were no stewards redirecting fans that day.
And keep in mind, too, since this wasn't the regular Liverpool stadium, fans wouldn't be as familiar with the layout. I've been to enough Buffalo Sabres games, for instance, that I know the KeyBank Center has emergency stairwells and such in certain places. But a Toronto Maple Leafs fan who comes for an away game might not be able to find those things so easily.
Yeah, exactly. It was just all these factors accumulating. And I imagine for Liverpool fans who are not as familiar with Hillsborough, they didn't even know where the exits are, what the procedures are. So they were thrown into a very, very disturbing situation. And as things evolved, the surge in Pen 3 causes the barrier separating the pen from the stadium to give way. This is, by the way, 2 minutes into the match. And apparently, during the inquiry, Liverpool goalkeeper Bruce Groblar testified that he was hearing fans behind him, because it was the Liverpool goalkeeper who was in front of the stand at the time. He was hearing fans behind him screaming for help and, begging to be allowed into the pitch.
That's horrific.
Oh, yeah, it's traumatic as hell. And at that point, at around 5 minutes into the game, the South Yorkshire Police Superintendent Greenwood, who's under David Duckenfield, realizes the issue and orders the ref to pause the match. So at this point, finally the match is paused and the players are escorted to their lockers. Meanwhile, fans in the Liverpool section are breaking parts of the barrier to let other fans out, flooding the pitch, basically. Initially, the cops thought it was a pitch invasion and were trying to stop it. But eventually they realized what was going on. Meanwhile, other fans were being pulled up into the upper west stand by the fans who are sitting in the upper tier are pulling fans from the lower tier up. You could see it in the video. It's really horrifying. Fans being pulled up, trying to climb to safety. And other fans are doing CPR on their fellow fans who are dying of asphyxia.
Asphyxia is an absolutely horrible way to die. I'm going to read a quote from Wikipedia. If you have claustrophobia or fear of crowds, I would recommend you skip forward about 30 seconds to a minute. Quote, "In confined spaces, people push and lean against each other. Evidence from bent steel railings in several fatal crowd accidents have shown horizontal fences equivalent to a weight of approximately 450 kilograms or 1,014 pounds. In cases where people have stacked up on each other forming a human pile, estimations have been made of around 380 kilograms or 838 pounds of compressive weight in the lowest layer." End quote. Now, I've never been in a crush like this, but I mentioned today, I have severe food allergies and I've suffered from anaphylaxis before, including one incident last weekend. And I can tell you, the moment when you realize you're starting to suffocate is absolutely petrifying. Even when you know help is on the way and you're most likely going to be fine, there's just this indescribable feeling of dread where you're like, I could die from this.
I did want to point out that, like, like you said, it's horrifying when I've had incidents where, like, I'm choking on food or whatever, and, like, it's not bad enough that it even requires, like, Heimlich maneuver or anything. But the few milliseconds where you're choking is the most horrifying thing on the planet. Like, you feel so helpless. It's really, really scary.
And keep in mind, too, this was 1989. People didn't have cell phones and easy ways of communicating with their friends and family in the stands, asking if they were okay. So you also have people frantically searching for their friends and unable to find them, resulting in even more panic.
Yeah, imagine if you manage to escape this crowd, but your brother or your dad or whatever is not with you, so you try to go back in there, and it's just chaos as everyone is trying to find their friends, trying to escape. It's just pandemonium.
Right, and to make matters even more confusing, lots of people would have been wearing Liverpool gear, kits and other things.
Oh, yeah.
So they would have looked the same. Like, you can't find your friends in a crowd where everyone's dressed the same on purpose.
Yeah, there's no, like, identifying, like, oh, I'm wearing a yellow jacket or whatever. Almost everyone is wearing Liverpool gears, like you said. Yeah, it's awful. And yeah, South Yorkshire Police Chief Superintendent John Nesbitt later tells the MPs during the inquiry that leaving medical intervention to fans was a deliberate strategy to avoid the fans unleashing their frustration on the cops, which tells you that the cops knew they fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Regularly, the medical protocol is that ambulances are parked at the entrance to the gymnasium of the stadium, which is called the casualty reception point. And the procedure is for the superintendent or chief superintendent, in this case, David Duckenfield, to declare an emergency which will allow fans or players to be ferried from the pitch to the ambulances. But without the declaration, there was no direction, right? Some paramedics, they thought they had to go to the pitch. Others were waiting. The fans didn't know where to take their injured fellow fans. So there was just a breakdown on all levels of communication and direction. Some paramedics later testified that they were coming into the pitch to try and help, but all their machines were on the ambulances and the ambulances weren't allowed onto the pitch. Of 93 ambulances that were there, only 3 were allowed onto the pitch to help.
Right, and then keep in mind, all these ambulances are arriving. Some paramedics leave the ambulance to go to the pitch to try and help people, and that ambulance is then blocking other ambulances from leaving with patients in the back.
Yeah, oh yeah, and there was no direction as to getting people out as soon as possible. Just to reflect how badly the cops botched it and then how awful they are, they were going around breathalyzing fans and asking fans if they drank. And I'm talking fans as young as 12 years old. And they were asking them if they drank beer to determine if they were drunk and to use the whether they're drunk as an excuse that, this was caused by drunk fans.
Oh, for fuck's sake. There was a stampede at Hajj in 2015 where over 2,000 people died. Literally the most sober event on the fucking planet in Saudi fucking Arabia.
Yeah, well, I want to go to Hajj and drop some MDMA. That sounds like a fun thing to do.
They cut people up, Amr.
That is a good point. But also, that's actually a funny story. I mean, funny in a depressing way. Apparently, that stampede was caused because some Saudi royal wanted to go from one point in Hajj to another without, going with the crowd. So his bodyguards were basically clearing a way for him, which led to, the crush and the stampede. Well, it gets even better because then the Saudi authorities initially came out and blamed the stampede on pilgrims from Africa and South Asia.
So racist. And it goes to show it doesn't take any alcohol to cause an event like this. It doesn't take any inebriation.
Yeah, it just takes a couple of people panicking, and rightfully so, for everything to break down. After this event, the day after, Margaret Thatcher visits the stadium and lays some flowers, and there's a whole, spectacle of politicians, condolences, and all of that. And an inquiry is organized and led by Lord Justice Peter Taylor, and he finds that severe police deficiencies led to the disaster. From the report, quote, "In all, some 65 police officers gave oral evidence at the inquiry. Sadly, I must report that for the most part, the quality of their evidence was in inverse proportion to their rank," end quote.
Oh my God. Well, those actually low rank, probably working class officers felt more solidarity with the people who had been killed.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are stories of their superior officers basically telling them, this is what you're going to testify. Don't, this is what you're going to tell the authorities. And I imagine many of them, this traumatized them too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he also found that fans were, quote, "not drunk nor even the worse for drink," end quote, which was contrary to the police blaming the fans for being drunk. This is just the beginning of the hell that was this. So the media coverage begins to really unleash its disdain for the working class. And for our American listeners, you think Fox News is bad, you think the American press is bad, wait until you see the British tabloids. The British tabloids are perhaps the most parasitical entities on the planet. The most parasitical among them is The Sun. Obligatory fuck The Sun, because The Sun on April 19th, 4 days after this incident, runs a headline titled, in big, bold headline font, "The Truth." And in this article, it claims that drunk fans peed on EMTs administering help, that fans were robbing the corpses of other fans, and fans were late to the match and being drunk, which is what caused the crush, and also accused fans of attempting to enter the stadium without tickets, which Lord Peter Taylor had determined that it was a non-factor in this crush.
Yeah, the Liverpool fans were pretty much immediately blamed for causing the crush and accused of violence and drunkenness. Like we said, nobody causes a crush. There are safety regulations which must be followed in order to avoid a crush, yes. But a stampede isn't caused by an individual or a set of individuals behaving irresponsibly. It's a failure of a crowd control system. In this case, a series of poor decisions made by police.
Exactly. And not only was it was poor decisions, but there is decisions to cover up their mistakes that really added, insult to injury. And, the other media follows the coverage because they're getting their talking points from the cops themselves. And that led to what I think is one of the better results. The Sun, the newspaper The Sun, is boycotted in the city of Liverpool. It still is. No one buys The Sun. No shops stock it. It's completely banned from Liverpool.
Good. The Sun is notorious for a certain type of tabloid fodder that centers on shaming people on benefits. They frequently publish stories about people on government assistance who they decide are living too lavishly. And it's obviously an effort to pit working class people against each other. Quote unquote, taxpayers are meant to feel cheated that people claiming benefits might have nice things too. Like, how is a single mother buying Christmas presents for her kids with money that she got by saving up her benefits? How is that a fucking news story? Who cares?
Oh, yeah. I mean, their entire model is built around demonizing immigrants, poor people, just vile publication. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch, which tells you all you need to know about it. Speaking of which, The Sun's editor, Calvin Mackenzie, apologized to a committee in 1993, but then retracted his apology in November 2006, claiming that newspaper owner Rupert Murdoch had forced him to apologize to, basically a PR maneuver to try and subside the controversy around The Sun. And then Mackenzie eventually apologizes again in 2012 once an initial report of a second inquiry is published, basically completely exonerating the fans, and the inquest is by Sir John Goldring.
I definitely want to do more on this sort of working class shaming tabloid fodder that you see in The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Metro is another one. You see it in Ireland as well. You see it in the US and Canada. But to be honest, having lived in the US, Ireland, and the UK, I felt that it was the worst in Ireland and the UK.
Oh, the UK's tabloid press, The Sun and the Daily Mail in particular, they're just like the parasites par excellence. They're just parasites par excellence, really. I think it's really interesting that, Rupert Murdoch made Calvin Mackenzie apologize initially. But I think that was more because of the blowback from the political establishment and so on. It does say a lot also, like speaking as someone who's in Toronto and lived in Toronto, the worst publication we have here in Toronto is called the Toronto Sun, and it's owned under the same umbrella.
Well, also, I'm not going to sit here and say everyone who depends on benefits is an angel. Of course, that's not the case. But why is it a news story when someone who claims government benefits does something that we consider bad or wasteful or antisocial? Why is it a news story? Ask yourself why we would want to read about that.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. It's very voyeuristic too. They'll have like the headlines and then they'll have pictures of like some poor woman in a grocery shop, to be a picture taken without her consent or knowledge. And it's like, look, she's buying like nice chocolate or something.
Right, or cigarettes or alcohol. People who are poor and depend on cigarettes or alcohol, and it is a dependence, are shamed for that, very much so.
Oh yeah, when people like Boris Johnson drink scotch by the bottle, that's fine. But a working class person buying a pack of cigarettes, that's where we have to lose our mind.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gold Ring report that I just said is the second inquest, and it exonerates the fans completely. It's organized between 2012 and 2016. And it completely faults the South Yorkshire Police for the failures, naming in particular police match commander David Duckenfield as the chief culprit.
This is also important in terms of preventing a similar occurrence in the future. Aside from placing blame, it's crucial to lay out the evidence to develop better safety protocols. You can't learn from mistakes if you don't address what those mistakes are.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of it is justice, in this case, justice for the 96 victims who died, and showing accountability for the failures. If you're a cop, if you're someone who's invested with power by the state to act in protection of others, and not only do you fail, but you then lie to cover up your failures, there needs to be some accountability there.
Right, and there should be accountability after the fact as well, because several survivors of the crush died by suicide in the following years, and more struggle with mental health issues, including alcoholism and drug abuse, as a result of the trauma they endured that day. And the blame those people faced in the media for causing the crush couldn't have helped. Like, you witnessed this horrible thing, you survived this horrible thing, and then these tabloids come out and say, you are the reason that this happened.
Oh, yeah, it's awful. And, like you said, several survivors died by suicide. Yeah, when we talk about justice for the 96, when we talk about the 96 victims, we're talking about people who directly died in the crush. Whether it's the 94 who died that day, the 95th who died a few days later, or the 96th who was in a vegetative state and then died. But that's not counting the people who died committing suicide, the ones who died due to alcoholism-related issues resulting from this, drug abuse. Countless marriages were destroyed because of this. Like, the trauma is very, very hard to understate. And, like you said, if you go home and you look at the press and they're saying, yes, you killed these people. And it's not just the press, by the way. Like you said, you know how the Sun tries to pit working class people against each other insofar as it blames certain working class people for economic conditions beyond their control. One of the interesting things in Hillsborough is that it led to fans from other clubs, like segments of fans in other clubs, like Manchester United or Chelsea, for example, who would chant against, like whenever they play Liverpool, their fans would chant, always the victims, it's never your fault, in sarcasm, as if they're like blaming the Liverpool fans. Yeah, it's awful. It's really awful.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Solidarity with you, Liverpool fans.
Yeah, credit to some fans, like Everton fans, for example, who've expressed solidarity with Liverpool fans. But yeah, you always have these fans who are very, very vile and will use tragedies like this as a way to get one over opponent fans. But yeah, it's really vile. It's really vile. One of the interesting things as an extension of that is the relationship between Thatcher and the working class in the north of England. The day after Thatcher went to the stadium and laid some flowers, which is all well and good for the press and for the media, but it does not reflect how much disdain Thatcher and the Conservatives had for the same working class fans who died before they died, and probably even during and after their death, insofar as Thatcher crushing the miners' strikes in the north, the complete deindustrialization of anything north of the M5, like I said, and just the general like gutting of the economic and social welfare state under Thatcher, and the move towards a financial hub in London. And everyone who's left outside of that, whether you're in Stoke, in Sunderland, in Newcastle, in Liverpool, to her, you're just lesser than an animal. The Tories, even today, you're nothing.
Right. She has all these policies gutting the north of England. You have this event, which is clearly a systemic failure, and then she shows up with flowers and crocodile tears for the media. And let me be clear, if I die in some sort of event or I am killed violently and or politically, we'll say, don't bring flowers. I want you to fucking organize.
Oh yeah, same here.
So I just want to point out too, often while the government takes its time compiling these reports, survivors and victims' families grow older and start to die because that's how time works. It goes in one direction. So in the meantime, people who might be receiving settlements from the government or just access to benefits like mental health care they need following a traumatic incident like that don't get those things because they come 25 years after the event itself. And we're actually seeing something really similar right now with the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire. The building itself was council housing, meaning the government is at least partially responsible for ensuring that it meets fire safety regulations, which it didn't, and 72 people died. But the government is now moving on to its second investigation on the causes of the fire. And meanwhile, those survivors and the families of the deceased are struggling with the trauma of that event. I agree that thorough investigations are important, but in the meantime, we need to give full support to survivors and family members. People cannot wait 25 years for relief. And in a more global context, you see this with regard to refugees and survivors of war. Like the state of Israel clearly hopes that Palestinian refugees will just die in exile and that their descendants will give up on return. Like I could go into a very long rant about how waiting is violence. Like waiting is allowing people to die in agony. It's horrible.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a war of attrition where you just hope that enough people die or lose interest or lose energy that you can just get away with your failures, with your criminality, with your irresponsibility, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I think it is violent. I think in the case of Hillsborough, it took countless hours and blood, sweat, and tears of the families of the victims campaigning to even get a second inquiry in 2012. That exonerated the fans. And even then, like, think of all the people who died from alcoholism, from drug abuse, from suicides, because the media kept telling them it was their fault, and there was no systemic effort to exonerate them.
And I think in cases where there's no clear perpetrator, for instance, we can contrast this with the Manchester arena bombing at the Ariana Grande concert, where a young man did a suicide bombing and killed dozens of young fans. Absolutely horrific event. But in that case, there's someone to blame, and the community, rightfully so, rallied around these victims and survivors. There were massive benefit concerts, and there was some semblance of healing. But in this case, where, first of all, it's the state who is the perpetrator because it's a systemic failure, and the fans are working class football fans, they're not young girls who are fans of Ariana Grande, the reaction is completely different.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in the Manchester bombing, it's really interesting you brought that up because it's also, like you said, it's not the state directly caused this, but there were a lot of links between the bomber, who was a Libyan who went to Libya to fight against Gaddafi during the civil war, and MI6, which I found really interesting. But, this guy has connections to MI6. And he goes and he comes back and he does this. But at the same time, it's easy for the state to organize a sort of solidarity when it comes to something like the Manchester bombing, because it aligns with the British state's foreign policy insofar as this is this young Arab Muslim man who did this bombing. And it's easy to fall back onto the tropes of terrorism in the Middle East and limiting immigration, this, that, and the other. Whereas with Hillsborough, it's the cops who failed. It's the cops who then covered it up. It goes contrary to everything the state stands for.
Yes, I could not have said it better.
On that happy note, I guess, we can wrap it up.
Yes, thank you so much, guys, for subscribing to the Patreon. As I mentioned before, my microphone was damaged when I moved out of Korea. So I am on a new microphone now. I hope you can hear the difference. I used the Patreon money to get a new microphone. So thank you.
Yeah,
You all made that
guys.
possible.
We really appreciate it. Yeah.
And we are ending our Arab Uprising series very soon. So since we're moving on to other episodes, we have plenty of ideas like floating around in our tank, but send requests because we love when you guys request episodes.
Yeah, we were happy to listen to requests and arrange for such things. So yeah, until next time, everyone, have a good one.
Bye.